Hi everyone, and welcome to Guelph Museum's Great Guelphites video series. My name's Ken, and I'm the Education Coordinator at Guelph Museums. I'm the museum's teacher, and I love to tell people about this great city and the people from our town who made an impact on Guelph, Canada, or the world. I really like our history, and I really enjoy sharing stories about Guelph and its people. Many people like to know about the really famous people who made a big impact on history. But I like to hear inspiring stories about the struggles people overcame. Stories about the really famous. Those are awesome. But I also like to hear about other people who aren't so famous. And today I want to talk to you about someone called Fred Hallet. Someone I'm sure you haven't heard anything about. He wasn't really famous, but he has a really neat story. During my talk today, we're going to do a drawing activity. You also need some paper and something to draw or write with. Or if you have a whiteboard and marker, you can use that too. Now, Fred lived in Guelph about 150 years ago. He wasn't born in Guelph, but he came here when he was 6 years old. And I imagine it must have been really exciting, but really scary for him to travel to a new country that he and his family knew very little about. He came from a place in England called Lewisham, which is near London. He had 7 brothers and sisters. His mom and dad did not have a lot of money. And it was tough having enough food on the table for all of the family to eat. And I expect Fred was hungry most of the time. Now, I don't have a picture of Fred when he was younger, but here's a picture of a boy who lived in Guelph at the same time Fred lived here. His name was Harrythorpe. Now, Fred's mom and dad realized that where they lived in England, there was a great poverty and hardship. There were not many jobs available, and that the jobs that were available were very low paying, and the work was hard, dirty, and could be really dangerous. The city that they lived in England had a workhouse and an infant poorhouse. Now, a workhouse is a place where people who cannot support themselves have a place to live. They'd get basic food and a place to sleep. But it was hoped that they could do some work to earn their keep too. The infant poorhouse was a place where children under the age of 12 would be kept if their parents weren't able to care for them. The children would be fed and clothed and get some basic schooling. And when they were old enough, they'd have to do some chores around the workhouse as well. And there were poorhouses in Canada too. Here's a picture of one that was operated not far from Guelph, near Fergus. The building's now the Wellington County Museum and Archives, but it was also a poorhouse. Now, Fred's father, he had a skilled profession. He was a blacksmith, and he hoped that by leaving Lewisham, England, and coming to Canada, his family would have a more successful and prosperous life. Now, a blacksmith did a lot of different things, and I've got a picture here of a blacksmith shop in Guelph. And most of the work that a blacksmith would do would be shoeing horses. So they'd have things like horseshoes that they'd have to make. So they'd get a piece of metal and they'd have to make it look like this to shape it to a horse's hoof. And they'd also have to make nails to attach these through these holes onto the horse's hoof. So that was a lot of work. And because everyone rode horses or had a horse and wagon, or they had an oxen to pull their wagon, they would need the blacksmith. Now these are also oxen shoes. They look a little bit different from the horseshoes because an ox has a cloven hoof. So they need a shoe for each side of the hoof. And so if they were working oxen and they were pulling a wagon, they'd need a shoe like this. And Fred's dad might have also been making bits for the horses. So there was lots of different things that he would have done. And because he was very skilled at it, he would have got a job very quickly in Guelph. Now, I don't really know why Fred's dad chose to come to Guelph. There's a few reasons, I think. But maybe it was because Guelph was known to be a growing city. It was growing very quickly, and there were jobs being created. Maybe it was because there was a train coming to Guelph, and the train connected Guelph to the outside world, and they could get in and out of Guelph very quickly and get to the outside world with all the products they were making. Maybe he thought that Guelph was a new young city that his family would have plenty of new opportunities to explore, and it could be a very prosperous place for them to live. So there's a few reasons that I think they moved here. But at the time Fred and his family moved here, Guelph was still a very new town. The city had grown steadily in the 50 years since it had started. And this is what Guelph looked like when Fred arrived. There's a couple pictures. Now the city had a lot of businesses cropping up. There were schools, there was a hospital, there were churches, there was a city hall and sports clubs, and a skating rink was going to be built soon. So there's lots of things that were happening in Guelph, and it was probably a pretty exciting place to move to. Now, Fred's family, when they came here, they would have sailed from England to Canada, and the voyage on the boat would have taken about 10 days. And here's a picture of a steamship that was actually chartered out of Guelph. Then, after arriving in Canada from their boat, they would have taken a train to probably from Halifax or Montreal to Guelph, and that would have been another 3 or 4 days. So it would have taken them almost 2 weeks to reach Guelph. And here's a picture of the Guelph train station. And you can see the horses and wagons out in front of it, and the train station with a train there, just unloading passengers. So we're going to take a break and do a quick drawing activity. When Fred and his family traveled to Guelph, they used several different modes of transportation. Let's think about the different types of transportation they traveled on to get to Guelph. They used a sailing ship, or a steamship, a train, horse and wagon, maybe a buggy or a carriage, and they walked. So let's take a couple of minutes and draw one of these different modes of transport. But I want to make it a little bit more challenging. Let's try drawing with our opposite hand that we normally draw with. So if you normally draw with your right hand, let's use your left. Or if you normally draw with your left hand, use your right. And you're going to find out later why I'm asking you to do this. So let's have white border, piece of paper, and I normally use my right hand, but I'm going to use my left. So let's try making a sailing ship. And I haven't practiced. It's going to look kind of like the Titanic, I think. It is definitely more challenging to use left hand, my opposite hand. And some of the sailing ships also had masts with sails. And that is supposed to be a sail. So maybe you can take another minute or two and try drawing, or you can finish your drawing later. And if you do really like your drawing, you can maybe send it into the museum or post it on the museum website. Then that'd be a lot of fun to see what your drawing looked like. I know it's a lot more challenging to draw with your opposite hand than you normally draw with. Now, Fred's father, William, was a skilled blacksmith and would have found work in a growing city very quickly. The main way to travel locally was the horse and buggy or a wagon, and every horse that they worked on, that did work in Guelph needed shoes. So he would have been very busy. So here's a picture of a blacksmith shoeing a horse. And because Guelph, this was before there were cars or buses or trucks. Everyone needed to travel around and to get from a farm to the city, or to move products around the city to the shops, they needed a horse and wagon. So a lot of working horses, a lot of working animals, and they all needed shoes. So Fred's dad, William, would have been a very busy man and would have got a job very quickly upon coming to Guelph. And because there were lots of industries springing up in Guelph too, he would have had his choice of where to work. But being a blacksmith would have been busy. It would have been very demanding for Fred's dad. When they arrived in Guelph, think of how hard it would have been to arrive here with 7 children and his wife, no place to stay. So they had to find a home, they had to look for a job, and he also had to keep his kids fed, and they had to look for a school too for all the kids to go to. So it was probably a very tough time for Fred's father and mother to get the kids settled and get a home and established. Now, how would you think Fred felt leaving a big city in England and coming to a very small growing town in Canada? Now, I'm sure you'd feel nervous, feel pretty scared, and maybe even excited, or all of these emotions. And soon after Fred arrived, he would have had to attend at school. He would have signed up to school. And the closest school to his home was Central Public School. And here's a picture of Central Public School. As you can see, it's a big school. And it would have been, Fred would have been in a class with lots of children his age. And when he was in class, the desks in this class would have all been in a nice straight row. with the boys sitting on one side of the class and the girls sitting on the other. In those days, boys and girls were kept separated a great deal in school. When you entered the school, there was a separate entrance for boys and girls. And even when you came in from recess, there was a boys' entrance and a girls' entrance. And the girls would line up on the girls' side and the boys on the boys' side. And they never really mixed as much as they do today. You can still see this marked on some schools. If you go to Tytler Public School or even Victory Public School in Guelph, they still have the boys and girls entrance marked for the doors. But school wasn't something Fred stayed in for very long. He was 12 and he stopped going to school. He had finished grade 6 and he left school and went to get a job. Now Fred was known as a bright, intelligent little fellow and probably would have done really well if he stayed in school. But instead, he went to work at a place called the Raymond Sewing Machine Factory, which is, I've got Raymond sewing machines just behind me here. And here's a picture of the Raymond Sewing Machine Factory with a lot of the employees out front for a picture. But it wasn't really unusual for a 12-year-old to leave school and go to find work. Now, some businesses hired many children to work in their shops and factories, but businesses like doing that because they could pay the children a lot less than they'd pay an adult. But in Fred's time, some children were only paid $1 a week for their work. Now, some children, like Fred, they left home to become apprentices where they'd learned a trade like farming, carpentry, bricklaying, to name just a few trades. And then girls would also leave home to find a job, to become housemaids or work in someone else's home, cleaning, cooking, mending clothes, and doing chores. Neither of these types of jobs would pay very much, but the children would get room and board and training in a trade. And what room and board means is that where you worked, they provided a place for you to sleep, they provided your clothes, and provided food for you to eat too. Now, how would you feel if your parents sent you off to work at age 12? The factory Fred worked at was in downtown Guelph, and the money Fred made would have helped out with some of the expenses his parents had, as well as giving Fred spending money and some work experience. Now, Fred's family probably, they still didn't have a lot of money, even though Fred's dad was busy, but 7 kids was a lot to look after. So the money Fred brought home would have been really, really helpful for the family. Now, when Fred went to work, the factory would have been noisy and smelly and hazardous and really not a very safe place. But there was little thought put into the safety of the workers at that time when Fred was going to work, which was about 1870. It was a big factory Fred worked in, and there were lots of other employees doing a lot of different jobs. There were woodworkers and machinists, assembly line people, shippers, and more. You can see there's a picture of the inside of the Raymond factory with some of the equipment around that they were assembling and some of the workers. And right down in the middle looks like a young man who is probably not much older than Fred. Now, when Fred was 14, he operated a machine called a gear cutter. So we can see this picture of a sewing machine that Fred would have helped assemble, but a gear cutter would have helped cut up some of the equipment and shape some of the metal. So on February 3rd in the year 1879, this was a day that changed Fred's life forever. He was 15 years old, and he'd been working at Raymond's sewing machine factory for just over 2 years. And he had to do something. He had to replace a belt on his gear cutter. And here's a picture of the gear cutter that he would have been working on. And this was a job, replacing the belt was a job that Fred had done many, many times. So he placed the belt on a pulley and turned his head to see if it was set properly. And while he was doing that, he was pulled into the machinery. And some of his co-workers heard him cry out, and they ran and turned off the gear cutter. And when they turned it off, Fred had dropped down to the floor, and his left arm was injured beyond repair. In the year 1879, there were no ambulances or fire trucks to call for emergencies. Fred, he was made comfortable by his co-workers, and a doctor was called for. And Dr. McGregor arrived and bound up his arm. So Dr. McGregor would have come and brought his doctor's bag. He wouldn't have had any painkillers to give him. They would have probably given him a little bit of rum and to help sort of deaden the pain. And then he would have bandaged up his arm and stopped the bleeding. And unfortunately, Fred lost part of his arm in the gear cutter. So one half of his arm was gone. So the doctor bandaged up what he could, and it was cut off just below the elbow. But it was a very nasty wound. So the arm was bandaged up, and then he was taken to hospital. Now Fred's father was called, and he came to see Fred, and they said that Fred, after his injury, he didn't cry out or didn't cry at all. He just stayed very quiet and to be bandaged up. So he's probably in shock after it happened. And Fred's father, who was working at another factory downtown, quickly came over when he heard the news. And he was so overcome with emotion that people said he couldn't be consoled. He was so overcome with grief at Fred's really terrible injury. So Fred was taken to the Guelph General Hospital, where his arm was removed just above the elbow. And then Fred was sent home to rest. Fred recovered as best he could from this horrible accident. And when he was well enough, he returned back to work at Raymond's sewing machine factory. Now, he couldn't do the same job that he had before he lost his arm. So he was given a job as a wheel turner, where he only needed one hand to do his job. Now, I guess using the same hand, doing the same thing, his one good right arm got very sore from constant use. But that's the work that Fred had, and that's all he had to do. So Fred, even after the injury, he continued to live and work in Guelph. And he stayed in Guelph until he was 28 years old. Then he had a job opportunity in Chicago in the United States. And in the year 1891, Fred moved to Chicago. And a year after that, at the age of 29, Fred got married. So here's a picture of Fred when he was middle-aged, probably after he's been married. So Fred and his wife, Emily, they had 4 children: Hazel, Alfred Jr., I guess, William, and Anna. Their descendants continued to live in the United States. And then Alfred, he continued to live and work in the United States until he was 87 years old, and he died on January 12th in the year 1950. Now, it's unfortunate that Fred's childhood ended at age 12, and he had to go to work like a grown-up. And as more families moved from farms into cities, more children moved into the workforce. There were no laws against child labor in North America until the year 1838, so any children could go to work. And the first legislation for child labor in Canada wasn't until the year 1870 and the year 1880. So that was when Fred just was entering the workforce. In the year 1891 in Ontario, a law was passed making it compulsory for children to have to stay in school until they were 14. So Fred sort of was under that margin, and he went to work when he was 12. But about 10 years after his accident, they changed the law. Today in Canada, you need to be at least 16 years old to work full-time. So that means you should be staying in school until you're 16. Now, child labor still persists in some countries around the world, and Canada has signed treaties to try and abolish child labor. So child labor is something that still exists, but we're trying to fight against that. Now, would you guys like to live in Guelph at the same time as Fred? And if you had a choice, would you work in a factory, or would you work on a farm, or as a servant in someone's home? Life was hard for many people, but they worked hard, and they did what they had to do to make a better life for themselves and their family. Fred's father did that by moving to Guelph from England. And Fred did that by working hard in Guelph and then moving to the big city in the United States, where he raised his family and lived until he was 87 years old. So thanks for joining me today and learning a little bit more about life in growing industrial Guelph 150 years ago. And you found out that life back then wasn't always easy for everyone. Some people had really good lives. Some people had to work really hard, even at a very young age. And we also learned that one tragedy didn't stop a young boy named Fred from succeeding and living a long and prosperous life. So thanks for joining me, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.